Welcome, friends and foes, survivors and killers. Let's sit around the campfire together and talk about Dead by Daylight. Specifically, about Clive Barker's other legend of horror that our community simply will not stop talking about. Daniel Robitaille, better known as Candyman. Ah, Candyman. The famous spectral slasher that terrorised the box office in October 1992 and propelled Tony Todd and Virginia Madsen to stardom. Anyone who's been in the Dead by Daylight community longer than 5 minutes will know the obsessive fever pitch surrounding the potential for Candyman's arrival into our game. I think the first time I recall people petitioning for Candyman Dead by Daylight in any significant numbers was during the long run of original killer releases that ran in the aftermath of the Saw chapter, because between January 2018 and September 2019 we never actually had a full licensed chapter. Admittedly, we did have Ash arriving as a survivor in the Ash vs Evil Dead paragraph in April 2019, and Ghostface turning up in June of the same year, but they were both solo releases, and Ghostface is kind of an original character anyway, so we'll let him slide. Side note, to all the people saying that new killer designs are going to kill DBD, you can actually shut up. Back then, we went clown into spirit into old Legion. So take off your nostalgia goggles, what we've got now really isn't that bad. In any case, we had a full 18 months between actual full-blown licensed chapters, which was the longest break DBD had ever taken from licensed chapters and remains so to this day. So of course, rumours spread like wildfire about which killer would be guest starring in our little game next. All of our pre-existing licensed killers had been classic slashers of the late 20th century and early 21st. With every single one having come from a movie released between 1974 and 2010. So naturally, the community started to look for potential killer candidates from films that came between those time periods. Pinhead was a bit too weird, Chucky was way too weird, and Jason was pretty much off limits, not just because of Friday the 13th the game, but also the recently resolved lawsuit between Victor Miller and Sean Cunningham, covering the ownership of the franchise. And the idea of chapters based on TV shows like Stranger Things or horror games like Resident Evil or Silent Hill were still just that, ideas. The obvious option for a late 20th century cinematic slasher, therefore, was Candyman. And with that drought in licensed content came announcements of a Candyman remake or sequel in the works over at MGM. It's got everybody in a right old tizzy, where they would see anything that vaguely resembled a Hook, a Bee, or Tony Todd's face, and start doing cartwheels in the streets yelling, "Candyman confirmed!" And if you didn't notice, this tizzy was still ongoing even during the teaser period of the last chapter. Until the clues lined up to present Pinhead as our licensed killer for September, a lot of people, myself included, thought Candyman was likely inbound. Partially because the movie had just come out, and partially out of a frenzied hope that please, dear God, let it not be fucking Springtrap. Fast forward to October and we didn't get Candyman. But the interest in him still hasn't died down, so I thought I'd resurrect a video I made back in April about Resident Evil that turned out to be breathtakingly prophetic, and maybe try to turn it into a full series. So, just like I did with Resident Evil, I'm going to try to answer the question, would a Candyman chapter be able to work in Dead by Daylight? And if so, how? This isn't a prediction, this isn't a speculation, I'm just doing what I do best. Analysis from an artistic and creative standpoint. This video will be discussing spoilers for the 2021 Candyman sequel by Nia DaCosta at various points, but I'll do my best to keep these spoilers to a minimum, and they'll be tagged when they come up. So without further ado, let's dive right in and talk about Candyman. I want to start with a simple question. Who is Candyman and what does he do? To put it simply, Candyman is a ghost who haunts the Cabrini-Green public housing project in Chicago. He's an urban legend of a boogeyman who terrorizes those marginalized and persecuted for just trying to live their lives. And at the same time, he's a human, almost romantic figure, who was the victim of that same marginalisation and persecution in life. The urban legend and the misunderstood romantic. the two elements of Candyman's identity that behaviour would have to capture were they ever to try adapting him into the game. So let's start with the more personal angle, the tale of the original Candyman that we all know and love, Daniel Robitaille. Daniel Robitaille was a portrait artist in 1890, about the same time that the slums of the near north side of Chicago began to throng with industrial activity. This is the area that would eventually become Cabrini-Green. He was commissioned to paint a portrait of a wealthy businessman's beautiful virginal daughter. But Daniel felt the bite of the most tender trap there is, love. The two had a short relationship which rather fell apart when the businessman realised that this young black artist had gotten his daughter pregnant. So he paid some local thugs to rough up Daniel, chase him all the way across town before cutting his hand off and shoving a meat hook into the bloody stump. While the Robitaille screamed for mercy, they smeared his body in honey from a local apiary and let the bees sting him to death, before burning his body on a pyre. A vicious death for a young black man who didn't deserve it, and that's how the Candyman legacy began. All that violence, all that bloodshed and cruelty, because he did the most human thing there is. He loved. And that's something Candyman has always been about. In the original movie, the graduate student Helen Lyle became his newest object of obsession, and the story of the first Candyman movie warps around her. As she investigates deeper and deeper into the Candyman myth, the Spectre's newest spree of violence leaves a trail of blood back to her. Before long, she's suspected by the authorities and the residents of Cabrini-Green of reenacting the stories that she was studying. It was only when she sacrificed her life to save Candyman's newest victim, the baby Anthony McCoy, that she cleared her name. Sort of. Despite saving little Anthony and convincing his mother Anne Marie that she was innocent, Helen Lyle was still remembered by almost everybody else as the monster who abducted him to begin with. And that's the tone the first movie ends with. By being remembered as a monster just like Daniel himself, Helen Lyle became a new iteration of Candyman, immortalised as just another urban legend and an expansion to the Candyman mythos. And here's where we're going to start to dive into spoiler territory for the 2021 sequel, so hold tight and fast forward to this timestamp if you want to avoid spoilers. We know from the continuation to the story that the sequel shows us that the Candyman legend isn't specific to Daniel Robitaille himself. Robitaille was the first Candyman, the original, but he was far from the last. Every so often, the Candyman moniker passes from one victim to the next, just like it did with Helen, and it isn't even necessarily directly tied to Cabrini-Green itself. Even after he grows up with no memory of what Candyman did to him, young Anthony McCoy finds himself tormented by the Candyman legacy as an adult. And it follows the same formula as Helen. Candyman picks his victim out with care, and engineers his killing spree to weave his chosen obsession into his myth. While he intrudes more and more on the life of his victim to the point of paranoia, everyone except them believes them to be responsible for Candyman's murders. Eventually, Anthony McCoy becomes the new Candyman. After all these years, the baby from Cabrini-Green got to be his victim after all, just as it was always meant to be. Candyman is much more than an indiscriminate killing machine. For his brutality, his work is intimate, almost obsessive in the web he ensnares his victims in. And as such, I have a bold proposition for a potential power for Candyman. He should be our first obsession-related power in Dead by Daylight. We've had obsession perks, we've had a couple of obsession-related add-ons, we've never had a power that centres around and uses the obsession mechanic itself. And what better a killer to bring one into the game than the nightmare of Cabrini-Green himself. Admittedly, there are a couple of good reasons why they haven't done an obsession power yet. The big one being that until recently, not every game had an obsession. There had to be a perk or an add-on that brought the obsession into the game. But shortly after the Decisive Strike nerf, they made the obsession a permanent part of games, even if there's nothing to cause it. So ensuring every game with Candyman has an obsession is now no longer an issue. And the other concerns with an obsession power are also fairly easy to address. The mechanic of the power shouldn't incentivize the killer to tunnel the obsession like old dying light, but at the same time shouldn't punish the killer if the obsession chooses to take aggro. And it should have a means to switch the obsession so you still have a power if the obsession dies. And the romantic and fixated nature of Candyman could be played up in his animations too. Maybe he carries a normal survivor on his shoulders as he takes them to a hook, but if he's carrying the obsession he could bridal carry them like he carries Helen. Maybe he gets an obsession-specific terror radius, or chase music, or chase animations like Ghostface. And maybe he could even have a unique Mori for the obsession, like how Nemesis has unique voice lines when Moriing Stars members. But there's far more to Candyman than the hopeless romantic, tangling a single victim into the web of his mythology. A big part of who Candyman is the mythology itself. The legend makes the man. And as the line between reality and hallucination is blurred, Candyman is there to spill buckets of innocent blood. Because what is blood for if not for spilling? Candyman exists first and foremost as an urban legend, symbolising and preying on the socio-economic divide between the gentrified middle classes and the working class black citizens of Chicago that manifested in the Cabrini-Green social housing projects. For everyone who isn't familiar with the history of the real-life Cabrini-Green projects, I want to tell you a little story. Cabrini-Green was founded in 1942 with Francis Cabrini Homes building two-storey terraced houses in the near north side of Chicago, and was finished in 1966 when William Green Homes completed the last of the high-rise apartment blocks, and the point of them was ostensibly to create large amounts of low-income social housing to accommodate the poor. But the apartments quickly fell into decay, as the Chicago Housing Authority basically left the projects to rot. Because the 75% white Italian communities that the projects had been built for slowly turned into a black majority neighbourhood, and the factories and refineries closed down, leaving huge numbers of people unemployed. Public services such as waste collection, utilities, public transport, and even basic structural maintenance stopped, to create the hub of Urban Decay that formed the backbone of Candyman's overall tone. Rubbish collection was so bad that in one case a stacked up tower of rotting bin bags in a lift shaft reached up to the 15th floor. Wire mesh was put up on the balconies to cage the residents in. And apartments that burned down in a fire weren't restored for habitation but instead just boarded up and left to gather dust. And gang violence flourished in the project as a result, because that's what happens when you have tons of unemployed people and give them no support or public services whatsoever. A new gang-centric power structure will develop to allow people to survive when nothing else will. By the time the people of Chicago realised just how bad this was, the gangs were already well ensconced enough that all the problems with Cabrini-Green were blamed on them, not the failings of the Chicago Housing Authority that had allowed the gang to spring up in the first place. Cabrini-Green had become a national byword for the worst of public housing. Think of it as the Grenfell Tower of the United States. And Candyman being set there was no coincidence. The people of Cabrini-Green were living lives ruled by fear and desperation because they were being ignored by the rest of the city, the rest of the world even. Their squalid living conditions were left to fester like an open wound, and Candyman was the resultant infection. He was the physical manifestation of all the fears and anxieties about life in the projects, and every act of violence he committed, big or small, was indiscriminate in its cruelty. From putting razor blades in Halloween candy to castrating children in bathrooms. Candyman was a vicious monster whose impact on the project and its inhabitants stained them in ways that could never be washed out. Or was he? Because it's left ambiguous which acts of violence Candyman himself even did, and how much was the result of the aforementioned gang violence that was merely blamed on the legendary figure. If it wasn't for the sequels, the ambiguous and dreamlike nature of the original movie calls into question whether Candyman was the spectre of a real man or just a bugbear that the residents of the project attributed their disasters to. Because if Candyman wasn't causing these random acts of violence and brutality, the reality that this violence was the result of a city that didn't care about them and left them to rot might be too much for the Cabrini-Green residents to live with. Once again, If you haven't seen the 2021 sequel, this is a spoiler alert. So skip to the timestamp right here if you want to avoid spoilers. The new movie actually played into this legendary boogeyman super well, while expanding on the lives of black people in America beyond the confines of Cabrini-Green. The high-rise buildings were demolished and replaced with fancy condos for the middle class, not too dissimilar to the one that Helen herself had in the original movie. So you'd think with the urban decay of the project washed out, Candyman would be gone with it, right? But just because the symptom of the disease is past, doesn't mean the rot is gone, it just comes back in a new way. Ghettoization might be a thing of the past in the new Cabrini-Green, but the discrimination that led to that ghettoization is still showcased starkly through the very topical lens of police brutality. Sherman Fields, one of these Candymen that got brought into the fold just like Helen, was killed by police in 1977 under the false suspicion of putting razor blades in children's Halloween candy. It might not have been the rot of Cabrini itself that killed Fields, but it's the same thing that caused the rot, the alienation of the working class black people of America. The movie also uses the real-life murders of George Stinney and James Byrd Jr., who both died as unjust victims of white supremacy, to add further weight to this idea of Candyman not being a product of Cabrini-Green specifically, but a product of the white supremacy that allowed the decay of Cabrini-Green to happen for 50 years. And where Candyman resided, those who believed his myths continued to treat his name with both terror and reverence. Something to blame for all the hardships, all the mistreatment, that despite the years flying by, had never truly stopped. They feared him and mythologized him, creating graffiti in his honour and offering candy to appease him. But it was that same fear that allowed him to exert his influence in the world. And nowhere was that more obvious than when you look at the ritual to summon him. You say his name 5 times into a mirror, and he'll turn up in your reflection and kill you. You might think this is kind of dumb, right? What kind of idiot would intentionally do something like that to summon him and basically ask him to kill them? It's very simple. The one thing that Candyman is truly vulnerable to is doubt in his existence. Anybody who performs a ritual is expressing that doubt, betting their lives on him not existing by provoking him. If he lets them live and lets people continue to believe that he's not real, soon he won't be. So he has to prove his existence by killing anyone who tempts their fate by summoning him. The ritual summons him because people believe it won't. Any attempts to adapt him into Dead by Daylight should start here. Candyman is first and foremost a legend. He's not a man of flesh and blood like Michael Myers, he's a whispered name spread around the people of Cabrini-Green, made real by people's fear and belief in him. We haven't had a stealth killer since Ghostface 2 years ago, so I like to think that we're long overdue for a new one, and Candyman would be as good a candidate as any. Survivors should be able to tempt fate by summoning him, kinda like Pinhead, and his presence, his legend, should be as much a weapon as his hook. Invoking his ire by doubting his existence should bring him straight to you, forcing him into the open to confront you head on, while the myths and legends surrounding him aren't enough to scare you off. But before I go on to my full Candyman power concept using the design criteria, and you will see I will get to that at the end, I want to address survivor and map options briefly. First things first, Pinhead has shown us that you don't really need a licensed survivor to come with a licensed killer. I mean, they could have had Kirsty Cotton as Pinhead's survivor, but obviously they didn't. Presumably because they couldn't find a way to make her mechanically unique and distinguishable enough to justify including her. And I feel like Candyman might be in the same boat. Helen Lyle would be the obvious option for a Candyman survivor, and as much as I do like Helen, I'm not really sure what they could do with her perks-wise to give her her own identity. Not to mention her arriving as a survivor would kinda cheapen her transformation into the new Candyman figure at the end of the movie. Having her revert from spooky ghost lady into just her regular grad student self would just feel, cheap. And none of the other options except maybe Anne-Marie McCoy from the original, or Brianna from the 2021 sequel, really have enough unique character to make them truly memorable inclusions in the DBD Survivor lineup. As for a map, however, this to me is a little more interesting. The last Cabrini-Green high-rise building wasn't demolished until 2011. So this vile sprawl that acted as a stain on Chicago's name stayed around for almost 70 years, despite the people living there essentially being ghettoised from the rest of the city. So my suggestion for a map is not what a lot of people might think when I advocate for a Candyman map. I don't want the high-rise skyscrapers to be immortalised in DBD, I want to see its ruins. I want to see the run-down bathroom from the original, where Helen was attacked. I want Sherman Field's hiding place from the sequel. And I want it to all be approximately on ground level, with enough ruined buildings and debris to build basic tiles like LTs and jungle gyms around the ruins of Cabrini-Green, as if the entity had scooped it up in the middle of the demolition process. It would fill in the gap between the original and the much later sequel, in a logical and novel way, and allow us to get immersed in the rotting urban sprawl of near Northside Chicago without forcing us into another RPD situation where the game's aesthetics come at a significant cost to the map's actual playability. But speaking of balancing aesthetics and playability, remember that thing I mentioned earlier? A full power concept? Well, if I was designing a way to appropriately integrate Candyman's power set into DBD, these are the ingredients I think we'd want. A stealth-based power that plays with the obsession, that encourages the obsession to play differently from the rest of the team without encouraging tunneling. While the obsession is acutely aware of Candyman's presence, perhaps to the point of paranoia, the other survivors should be more and more oblivious to Candyman's location, so he can capitalise on them letting their guard down. He'd be a tall 115 killer with a normal sized terror radius, nothing too special there, and his weapon would be his hook. But as for his power, well, let me just jump right into it. The Candyman's power, Be My Victim, has two parts. Say My Name and Reign of Terror. Say My Name. 6 mirrors are positioned around the edges of the map. Candyman can teleport from one mirror to another on a relatively small cooldown.
Hello there.
A survivor can perform a short Say His Name action at any mirror, highlighting them with Killer Instinct for a few seconds. Candyman can teleport to that mirror during this time. If he chooses to teleport, or the survivor completes the action, they become the obsession and all mirrors smash, becoming unusable for a significant period of time. This would serve to give Candyman some consistent map pressure that would scale well with bigger and bigger maps. It would function similarly to a preset ring of Demogorgon portals around the map. The survivors being able to interact with them both allows an obsession juggling mechanic baked into the base kit, as well as giving them a way to interact with his teleportation and stop him pressuring certain areas of the map. Reign of Terror. Survivors who are not the obsession can only see Candyman intermittently, with a regular but infrequent phase pattern. However, when Candyman attacks, you can always see him. The idea of this is to bring back a mechanic that was quite popular about Old Freddy. Experienced players of Old Freddy could use his flickering during the dream transition to misguide survivors into walking into the wrong place. I'd like to see this mechanic come back as part of Candyman, so I think weaving it into his kit for anybody who is not the obsession would be thematic and interesting. Whenever the Candyman hits a survivor who is not the obsession, Reign of Terror gains 2 charges. If the obsession escapes from a chase, Reign of Terror gains 1 charge. You can only gain a stack this way once every 30 seconds. This is the core of the mechanic, and it would encourage the Candyman player not to tunnel the obsession and to save the best for last, pun intended. However, still gaining a stack when breaking chase with the obsession would punish the obsession for trying to use that to body block or cover for their teammates, because all Candyman needs to do then is walk away and get a stack. For each charge, Candyman's terror radius is reduced by 4 meters, except for the obsession, who perceives his terror radius as being increased by 4 meters. The smallest that Candyman's terror radius can become this way is 8 meters. For each stack, he also gains a 4% increase in braking speed for pallets, breakable walls and generators. And at 4 stacks he receives a 50% increased lunge range. And the obsession will start to see illusory copies of Candyman. Think of them like the fake doctors that, well, Doctor has, except they move with Nemesis' zombie AI towards the obsession for a few seconds. The benefits of a smaller terror radius, faster braking speed and eventually an increased lunge range would be a good benefit for Candyman continuing to use his stealth to get hits, and would create an escalating sense of urgency to the point that survivors will always have to stay on their guard. In addition, the combination of Candyman's increased terror radius for the obsession and the illusory Candyman that would move towards them would really help to ramp up the paranoia of being the obsession. If you hear a terror radius super loudly and see a Candyman running towards you, you don't really want to stick around to find out if it's real or not. At 8 charges, Candyman can use a power button to activate Reign of Terror, immediately draining all charges and removing all their benefits. When Reign of Terror is activated, any smashed mirrors will immediately repair, and Candyman becomes undetectable for 60 seconds. During this time he will receive a 75% increased lunge range, and whenever he is pallet stunned, the pallet will instantly break, but he will still be stunned as normal. Think of it like permanent Spirit Fury without the enduring. When Reign of Terror is activated, all survivors will scream, and a 32-meter terror radius will start playing over the obsession as if they are carrying it. Think of it like Dark Devotion. This would be the apex of Candyman's power, fueled by him gaining stacks throughout the game. He'll be able to cash it in for a supercharged version of all the benefits he's currently received. The global scream means they can't wait out the Reign of Terror, and the reassembling of the mirrors means you'll instantly be able to teleport to wherever you need to be, to make the best use of your power. The combination of your increased lunge range and the instant pallet break means that greeting for stuns is a very dangerous affair, and the undetectability means you're likely to be able to get close enough to get a hit before they even realise that you're coming for them. The terror radius on the obsession was just a nice touch that I thought would really amplify the paranoia of the power, while also giving 300 per second infectious fright if you felt the need to run them. Whether this power concept will be fun or balanced if ever implemented into the game, I don't know, because I'm not a game designer, I'm just a lore guy with stupid hair. But what I do know is that it would be thematic. It should come as no surprise to anybody by now that I'm always in favour of thematic identity with licensed characters being a very high priority. And I think a power that heightens the paranoia of the obsession while rendering the killer basically invisible to everybody else would really play into the gothic horror feeling of Candyman. At some point, Dead by Daylight will have its last ever licensed killer. We don't know how long that could be, that might even take us to the end of DBD itself. But at some point, the license well is going to have to run dry. And many people have said that it already has. For every frenzied delusion like Chucky or Rubber or Christine, there are a dozen good licensed concepts out there that could work very well in Dead by Daylight. And if you ask me, the consistent fan interest in Candyman and the success of his recent movie has indicated that The Nightmare of Cabrini-Green is at the top of that list. Do I think he's our next license? Have I made lightning strike twice after my Resident Evil video? Honestly, I couldn't reasonably say. Admittedly, we have just gotten a Clive Barker adaptation already in the form of Hellraiser, but, you know, there are other licenses too. Friday the 13th, for example, is just coming out of its lawsuit between Victor Miller and Sean Cunningham, so Jason could be inbound for all we know. Maybe I'll have to make a fucking Five Nights at Freddy's video if Springtrap comes to the game. Or have something even crazier like a Xenomorph or a Predator or Sweeney Todd. All you need to do is search DBD concept on YouTube and you'll be covered in a deluge of amazing concepts made by very dedicated fans, and I'll be covering some of these ideas and killers in future episodes of this very series. And if Candyman ever does come, whether that's in 3 months, 3 chapters or 3 years, I hope Behaviour has the same dedication to doing his character right as they did with Pinhead. Because as much as many people I know found Pinhead to be quite underwhelming, I still stand by my statement that he's the best licensed chapter they've ever made, precisely because of their intimate loyalty to the source material. And no, before you ask, I'm not a Pinhead main now, I'm still a Twins lover as much as I ever was. But I have to give credit where it's due, plus I find Pinhead really fun. But I'm going off topic. Between the new movie's widespread critical and financial success, and the increased awareness of racial justice movements in the States and beyond that's made its social commentary even more relevant than it's ever been, Candyman has well and truly earned a slot in the horror hall of fame that is Dead by Daylight. Our game is a time capsule that brings icons of days gone by into the modern age, and I think it's long overdue that we summon the Candyman. But how do we do it? All we've got to do is say his name.
Candyman, 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 Candyman. Candyman.
Hello there.
Right, that's everything I have to say about the Nightmare of Cabrini-Green himself, Candyman. So what do you think? Are my conclusions fair? Does my power concept make sense? Or do you have a better idea, something you'd want to see Candyman do? Or do you just not care for him at all? Regardless, I'd love to see what you think in the comments. While you're down there, you can check the description to find my Discord, my Twitch, my Twitter, and my Ko-fi and Patreon links if you feel like this content deserves your money. I'll be working on my lore videos as normal, with Michaela coming next, but with this whole NFT news breaking and the plot developing in some pretty weird ways, I'll probably be making a second video to update what the hell is going on with these Hellraiser NFTs, so expect that in the next couple of days. If you haven't seen my video about these Hellraiser NFTs, then please do take a look, because it really is interesting just how viciously they're trying to scam us. But at any rate, whether the next video is a Michaela video or a video about his Hellraiser NFTs, regardless, I will see you next time. Ta-ta for now.